Faites l'appel, s'il vous plaît, monsieur le greffier.
Monsieur le connétable de Saint-Hélier. Madame le connétable de Saint-Laurent. Monsieur le connétable de Saint-Brelard.
Présent.
Monsieur le connétable de la Trinité. Monsieur le connétable de Saint-Pierre. Madame le connétable de Saint-Martin.
Présente.
Monsieur le connétable de Saint-Jean.
Présent.
Monsieur le connétable de Saint-Clément.
Présent.
Monsieur le connétable de Grouville.
Présent.
Monsieur le connétable de Saint-Ouen.
Présent.
Monsieur le connétable de Sainte-Marie.
Présent.
Monsieur le connétable de Saint-Sauveur.
Présent.
Monsieur le député Southern. Madame le député Larry.
Présente.
Monsieur le député Tadier.
Présent.
Monsieur le député Luce.
Présent.
Madame le député Dublé.
Présente.
Monsieur le député Morel. Madame le député Lehegara.
Présent.
Monsieur le député Ayer.
Présent.
Monsieur le député Ward. Madame le député Alves.
Présente.
Madame le député Gardner. Monsieur le député Gorst. Monsieur le député Farnham.
Présent.
Madame le député Moore. Monsieur le député Mezek.
Présent.
Monsieur le député Joseph. Monsieur le député Balash.
Présent.
Monsieur le député Coles.
Présent.
Madame le député Poré. Monsieur le député Warr.
Présent.
Madame le député Miles.
Présente.
Madame le député Scott.
Présente.
Monsieur le député Renouf.
Présent.
Madame le député Curtis. Madame le député Feltham. Madame le député Binet.
Présente.
Madame le député Jeune. Madame le député Miller.
Présente.
Madame le député Howell.
Présente.
Monsieur le député Binet. Monsieur le député Ferry.
Présent.
Madame le député Kovac. Monsieur le député Curtis.
Présent.
Madame le député Ward.
Présent.
Madame le député Wilson.
Présente.
Madame le député Stevenson.
Présente.
Monsieur le député Andrews.
Monsieur le doyen.
Notre aide soit au nom de Dieu qui a fait les cieux et la terre. Amen. Seigneur Dieu, Père éternel et tout-puissant, qui a établi les gouvernements et les puissances de la terre pour le règlement et pour la conduite du peuple, et qui nous a commandé d'avoir toujours pour but la gloire de ton saint nom. Nous te prions qu'il te plaise de donner à cette assemblée le don de conseil et de prudence, d'unir les cœurs et les affections de tous ceux qui la composent, de les conduire tellement, toi-même par ton Saint-Esprit, que toute l'heure de libération est accompagnée de ta bénédiction. Réussis au bien et au soulagement du peuple, qu'il te plût de commettre à leurs soins. Car nous t'en prions au nom et par les mérites de ton Fils bien-aimé Jésus-Christ, notre Seigneur, que nous a enseigné de t'invoquer en disant: Notre Père, qui es aux cieux, ton nom soit sanctifié, ton règne vienne, ta volonté soit faite en la terre comme au ciel. Donne-nous aujourd'hui notre pain quotidien, et nous pardonne nos offenses, comme nous pardonnons à ceux qui nous ont offensés. Et ne nous envoie pas en tentation, mais délivre-nous du mal. Car à toi la règne, la puissance et la gloire, au siècle des siècles. Amen.
Madame le connétable de Saint-Laurent.
Monsieur le connétable de Saint-Laurent est malade.
Vous jurez que Madame le connétable de Saint-Laurent est tellement indisposée qu'il ne peut pas assister aux États sans exposer sa santé. Monsieur le connétable de Saint-Pierre.
Sir, the Connétable of St Peter is attending at Government House. I ask if the Assembly might be minded to mark him as excusé until such time as he arrives in the Assembly later this morning.
Yes, excusez.
Monsieur le député Southern.
Présent.
Monsieur le député Morel.
Sir, may I ask that Deputy Morrell
L is excuse as per yesterday.
Excuse as in the same reason as yesterday.
Monsieur le Deputy Ward.
Sir, Deputy Ward is still away on State's business with the CPA.
State's business.
Monsieur le Deputy Gorst.
Default.
Monsieur le Deputy Ozef.
Default.
Madame le Deputy Felton.
Present.
Madame le Deputy Jern. Madame le Deputy Kovac.
Present.
Les états sont constitués. Very well. We continue with the debate.
Sir.
Yes, Deputy.
Sorry, sir. Can I just confirm with the Housing Minister that I still see on the State's website that under savings and other capital assets, there is no maximum savings or other capital assets?
No, I'm sorry, there is no mechanism within standing orders.
There isn't. Okay, I just want to say if he had signed that ministerial order or not. That was
well,
really
the answer is, I mean, yes, but I think that's something you could have asked out outside the confines of the Assembly, but there's no mechanism for simply asking a generalised question at any point during the course of a debate. Very well. We resume a debate on P26. I next have listed to speak Deputy Tadier.
Thanks, sir. The lesson is don't put your light on the night before. And I'm afraid the offer of a 3 or 4 minute speech is out of the window now. That's a one-time offer. But I'm not saying I will take the full 15 minutes either, sir. I do have some notes, though. Look, I'm also going to try and be sympathetic to the move of the proposition, because I think that's what we should all do anyway. I think he's identified what I think is maybe 1 or 2 problems that he sees which are valid, but what I see coming forward here is the wrong solution or the wrong solutions. And I'll first of all talk about what I think it is that he's trying to achieve, why I don't think it does it, and maybe what the options are for that. But let's bring ourselves back to the very real world that we live in. We have our own arm's length body that provides social housing. There are other organisations out there that provide social housing in the forms of trust, and they come under the Housing Gateway, which is the entry point for people applying for social rented housing. And we already have a scenario where the list is oversubscribed in all bands, I think the last time I checked, and that's been a perennial issue, and that's something which any housing minister and any housing supplier tries to get to grips with. It's because there isn't enough social housing stock. Historically, we've made a decision as an island, as an assembly and as a government that we wanted to rely on the private sector to try and fulfil some of the need that should have been arguably provided by the public sector, the social housing sector, and as a result we pay over tens of millions of pounds a year, or in the tens of millions, to private landlords as well as to social landlords on top of that to provide for that need. So we're not in a scenario where we can be glib or start making radical policy decisions about housing, I think, certainly not from a backbench point of view with due respect, when we've already got that scenario. If there was a scenario where actually there were no waiting lists and that Andium had lots of stock that they were having trouble renting out, then we might be in a completely different situation, but we're not. We live in the present and we live in the real world. The problem I think that the Deputy has, on the one hand, tapped upon, which is absolutely right, and it's something that nobody has ever got to grips with in the last 20 years that I can remember, is the issue that we hear often at election time about the question of downsizing. So we have pensioners, for example, who may have lived in their home all their lives. It's the empty nest phenomenon, I think it's called. So they may have a 3-4 bedroom house, which is they no longer necessarily wish to live in. They can't seem to downsize because there isn't any suitable properties, nothing affordable within their price bracket, and even if they did sell up, they'd be left with very little to show for it, and maybe a small cramped place to live in that might not be suitable. So I think that's an issue that we need to get to grips with. and it needs, I think, some creative thinking, and I'll perhaps come to that in a moment. And I think that the Minister is already aware of these issues, and I think he's already thinking along those lines. Certainly when we have private conversations one-to-one or as a party, that does figure in our thinking very much. Then I think there's this other issue which is, I think, slightly more tricky. The Deputy seems to be saying that there are some people out there who own a property, either outright or still paying off a mortgage when they get to pensionable age, and that they don't have any income otherwise apart from that. And that's an interesting, if difficult position to be in. I don't know how many of those exist. The Deputy says he may have identified a particular figure. But the issue is, if you own your own home outright or you're still paying a mortgage on it, your problem isn't housing, your problem is income. You don't need to be housed if you live in your own home. What you need to do is find a way to sustain yourself sustainably, if you excuse the repetition. You don't need to be housed, and you don't need to be housed in social housing, especially at a time when there's a big backlog on the waiting lists. So I think that's the thing I can't quite get my head around. And of course, the £200,000 asset savings doesn't have to be property. It could be that I, for example, get to the age of 67, it probably will be. I may not own any property at all, and I've just come into a windfall of £200,000. And then should I be able to knock on the door of the Housing Minister when there are people out there who have got maybe 50 pence in the bank, £50 in the bank, £1,000 in the bank, and don't have any property either, and expect to somehow go on a waiting list and perhaps leapfrog those people? Sure, I might have other circumstances which would make me eligible. There could be a disability, there could be a specific need, which may also already be captured indeed under the criteria. I just don't think that's the right thing to do at this stage, because we have to prioritise a waiting list, and to suggest that people would sell a house when they're already adequately housed in order to free up some cash to then go on a waiting list for social housing in itself is not going to solve any problems. It will create more problems, I'd suggest, than it solves. What we might want to do, and I would hope that this is something the Deputy and the Minister would consider looking into, is how we get to that, to unblock the housing market, indeed, if we can call it that. So there might need to be very imaginative schemes, because even if somebody under Deputy Warr's proposal would sell a property, let's face it, if you own any property in Jersey outright, even a small flat, it's going to take you over the £200,000 threshold anyway, so you wouldn't be eligible for his scheme. You wouldn't be able to apply for social housing anyway, so it doesn't help any of those individuals, irrespective of if that's one of their income streams. I would add also that the calculation that he's come about, which is, I think, I have to say, slightly contrived. It sets a minimum income standard based on a state's pension and a perceived rental income that you would get, not rental income, an interest rate that you would get from £200,000. Well, first of all, you'd have to be able to have that £200,000 sitting in a bank without touching it, paying the interest and living off that interest with your combined pension. But of course, that's based on a current 4.5% interest rate. So he's quite right that £200,000, if you had that, if you sold your partially owned flat and put that £200,000 in the bank, every week you would get £173 or £9,000 a year. But that's based on a 4.5% interest rate. As soon as the interest rate falls to 3%, guess what? Your income is slashed by a third, so you're getting £6,000 a year instead of the full £9,000. And what does that mean? Do we have to therefore increase the threshold to £300,000 and therefore mean that more people with more money? And if it goes to half, the interest rates fall to 2.25%, do we then say that the disregard needs to be £400,000? I think we are very quickly getting into fantasy land in this respect. So what I think needs to happen is that we need to identify genuine, sustainable housing schemes which do allow people to downsize, which might include Andium saying, you know, we will come up with a perhaps sophisticated scheme, but an understandable scheme which allows you to sell your property, preferably to us, because we need housing stock, and there may be some kind of arrangement about lifetime enjoyment of an Andean property at a modest peppercorn or whatever rent it might be. There may also be pensioners out there or relatively more wealthy individuals who would like the security of tenure of living in social housing, and it doesn't need to be Andean. This is something that maybe a trust could provide. But for them, the rental limits are not the issue. They might have a fair amount of money which they're willing to spend on rent. They just want the security of tenure. And that's where I think we could start doing some very interesting things around the market rates. So we know there's a proposition on the table at the moment, I think, to look at Andean rents, bringing them down to 70%. But it may well be, if we have a scenario where there's more housing stock, where Andean are actually buying up houses which our residents don't need anymore, they could sell them into that scheme. They'd be in that scheme in perpetuity, certainly on the death of the people who sell the homes. And we get family homes being brought into Andean with the capability of them maintaining them, doing them up to a good standard, increasing the stock, and everybody's a winner. What I would say is that's blue sky thinking. We're not at that point yet. And it's going to need some joint policy formation, not just from the ministerial team, but from across the Assembly. So what I would say, with due respect to Deputy Warr, and perhaps to an element with Deputy Mezek as well as Housing Minister, I think we've all got that goal as our intention, and I think it needs probably a bit more work to get to that point. And I don't think what we've seen in front of us today from Deputy Warr, as aspirational as it is, I think it's fraught with problems that make it practically unworkable. The thresholds simply don't stack up mathematically, and they're not future-proofed. And I think what we need to do is give Deputy Mezek, as Housing Minister, the scope to look at this in the round, to speak to his ministerial colleagues and other backbenchers to really get to where we need to be, so that we have a more sustainable social housing market, which does take account of those who, as Deputy Warr has suggested, may well fall between the stools at the moment.
Very much, Deputy.
Sir, can I remove the default on Deputy Joseph, please?
Yes, the default on Deputy Joseph is raised. I next have to speak Deputy Alex Curtis. I then have Deputies Coles, Andrews and Renouf in that order. Those are the ones I have on my list, just so people know. Deputy Curtis.
Thank you, sir. I have to say I'm probably not currently feeling like I can support this one, although I have to say I've been moving between how I feel. I turned my light on to speak to what the Housing Minister said, which is something I fundamentally disagree with, which was that we are giving him a vote of confidence in his mission and his ministerial order if we vote against this proposition today. There clearly is merit to some in looking at the banding, looking at the asset allowance. But what we don't have on the table right now is a decision as to, A, do we choose Deputy Warr's threshold and approach, or B, do we choose the Minister for Housing's? Because if that had been proposed as an amendment to this, I would likely also not support what the Minister is proposing as written. I know, obviously, I think the challenge members have with whether this is a fait accompli, and I sympathise with Deputy Warr, was on the Affordable Housing Gateway website, as of now, it still does list that there is no maximum savings or other capital allowances, which I believe is what, and I'm sure that may be addressed by another member, and so that is correct at the moment. That's incorrect, is what the Minister is highlighting. So I think Deputy Warr was obviously highlighting that. The Minister is highlighting back that the information on the website is still incorrect, and I'm sure they will get to that. But it is not the case today that we should consider voting against a backbencher's proposition is a move in favour of what the Minister for Housing wants to do. He has that power by order, but as we all know, sir, orders can come to the Assembly under Article 11 of the legislation 2021 Jersey law. Any member has the power to bring that to the Assembly. It does feel, however, though, that is not the route we should pursue. We should hopefully have a housing minister, I would like to say, that would, on such a fundamental change, consult with members before, maybe brief members and test the mood of the Assembly for that direction. Because it is a big one, it informs Andium's strategy. Andium's strategy informs Andium's debt, the state of Jersey's debt, and our approach to how we provide housing in both the social and private sector. A look to the March 2025 Affordable Housing Gateway statistics does show 759 people in the affordable rental demand sector. Diving into those numbers, roughly half of those are what are considered transfers within the bands. Half are largely considered transfers from the private sector, obviously half of the transfers in the system between categories of housing. But what the Gateway statistics tries to make clear is the good news is Andium Homes remains on site across several developments with 772 new homes. So the picture being painted is we may have a demand, we may have a long gateway, but the build plan accommodates the gateway. But when we open and widen that, band 3 will grow. And Andium will turn around and say, and other social housing providers might turn around and go, we need to provide more social housing, we must continue to build at a time when actually it's incredibly hard for even the private sector to build, and we will create that mismatch in demand that I think Deputy Tadier said, if we had lots of housing we might change our guidance, but likewise if we have more demand we may need to build more housing. And so the decision to completely change whether we allow those with a large amount of assets onto band 3 will change whether Andium want to build more, or whether they feel compelled to, or whether the minister feels compelled to, all of which in turn affects our ability to borrow. It affects our property makeup, how many people are living in what are currently fundamentally large apartment blocks rather than often smaller apartment blocks. There are merits to having a diverse and blended stock between properties which have 2 or 3 flats or apartments or houses in them to those which have in excess of 200. Andium's current model has been to build things which are on that larger side, the Limes, Edinburgh House and Maison Les Arches. These are decisions as to how we want to house our island that should not fall into a ministerial order to change the capacity that the bands for the Affordable Housing Gateway will have on them. And lastly, I'm trying to work this one out, and I think unfortunately, like many debates, they come too late. And we're trying to debate this on the floor of the Assembly rather than hash through the kind of the decisions going on. And I'm trying to equate whether actually somebody, what other situations somebody could have equal worth and sit in social housing. Well, for a start, we know that people can be on social housing, be within the Andium or other stock and increase their assets. They can increase their salary and they will remain within that social housing provision. So somebody who is late to the game in some way punished, perhaps. But also, if this is targeting a certain demographic of people, how do we treat pensions? Many of those in social housing, no doubt, are still on a defined benefit scheme, which if you total up the annuity or the value of that, is going to be huge. It's going to be well in excess of 200,000 if somebody is claiming even 12 or 15,000 pounds per year and is likely to live 30 years. That's 450,000 pounds of value. So somebody who is self-employed, who perhaps didn't use pension products for most of their life, will now be affected. So I can see the case here. But I don't think either option on the table, rejecting this and accepting carte blanche the minister's proposals, which we haven't necessarily seen yet, we haven't worked them through yet, we don't know them, I don't think scrutiny have been briefed on them, nor accepting exactly 200,000 as the defined limit that we go forward with at great pace is the answer. But I think it's a discussion the Assembly need and must take into consideration the impact on the build programme and the desire to build or not of largely Andium, and take that in the round and return for some informed debate before we actually go forward with just a decision. Thank you, sir.
Very much. Deputy Coles.
Thank you, sir. First, I just want to add possibly a little bit of clarity to what the Minister said yesterday in regards to the ministerial order, and as the Minister has already indicated that the information on the website is currently incorrect. He did mention that yesterday, that somebody had jumped the gun, and it still doesn't look like it's been taken down. But the question is about the decision-making ability of this Assembly, that if the Assembly does approve Deputy Warr's proposition today, that the Minister would then feel that that is what he is obliged to work to, and to say that actually, well, I'm going to bring my own thing over the top of this anyway, would actually be contempt of the Assembly, which he is not intending to do. So this is why it is a question of either vote today for Deputy Warr's proposition or vote against it for the Minister's order to bring in the remove the cap and limits. I too, along with Deputy Taddeo, would like to thank Deputy Warr for bringing this proposition, because actually it has highlighted that there is an issue, sir. In fact, I am aware of an individual themselves who currently owns their own property, a little one-bedroom flat, that has a bond on that property, so he technically only owns 50% of it, so should he need to sell that property, the value will come down below the £200,000 threshold that Deputy Warr is proposing. He has a very modest pension, but at the moment his pension balances his living state because he lives in the property with no rent. However, unfortunately, this is on the second floor of a property. He has got bad knees. At some point, he's not going to be able to do the stairs. He won't need to go into residential care for that. So what situation would he be left in? He'd be in a scenario where he's going to sell the property, have to use the return he gets out of that to pay rent in a private sector on a property that will have a lift, because he doesn't currently have one. And then after that, once that money's gone, he'll be then eating into the small pension that he gets, and he'll need more support from there. So it becomes very, very difficult. But if he was allowed to access social housing, he'd be able to get a lift at a reduced rent, which make his pension last a bit longer before then he's in the right place for everything to turn up. But of course, that's just one small example. And where I think the Deputy is more coming from with this proposition is people with larger houses being able to downsize. And this is where, for me, unfortunately, both the Minister's decision and Deputy Warr's proposition starts to have a little bit of an issue in my mind. So whether most members are probably aware, but I think it's a good time to use a public platform to mention that if somebody does sell a large property for, say, £600,000, willingly gives away £400,000 of that money to meet the criteria proposed by Deputy Warr, that if they then need to access long-term care or income support for any reason after that, they will not be able to, sir. Income support and LTC have rules about willingly making yourself worse off that you will then not be able to claim. So if somebody of pensionable age, where life can change very suddenly, that all of a sudden, maybe 5 years after they've given their property away, they'll be forced to try and find that money back from whoever they gave that £400,000 to cover the costs of their long-term care, which then could actually put their family members into more financial difficulty than they did originally. So that is something that this Assembly needs to be aware of, the public needs to be aware of, and whether we go with the Minister's decision, his Housing Advice Service needs to be aware of. If we go with Deputy Warr's, again, the Housing Advice Service needs to be aware of, and make sure that the public are fully informed that if this is something that you choose to do, there are risks. So we also have a big debate yesterday about discrimination, and of course Deputy Warr's proposition limits this figure to people over the age of 65. Now, sir, I'm 43 this year, and I'm staring down the barrel of 50 very quickly. And I stand there and think, if my circumstances change, and for whatever reason I'm forced to sell my home, say I get divorced or something like that, I might find myself in a position where I have £200,000, not necessarily now going to be eligible for a mortgage, and so I'm going to have to spend all that money myself in my 50s on private rent, because I don't know what's going to happen if I don't get re-elected in here. I don't know what my income's going to be once I leave here. But if I'm on a minimum wage job or a living wage job, or even earning about £36,000 a year, when you're paying about £1,500 a year in rent in the private market for a small one-bedroom flat, it's going to eat into a lot of that money, and the scenario is going to be very, very different. So this is where we actually, that range of 65 and over is well intended, but actually misses group of people who actually might not be able to access mortgages and actually find themselves in financial difficulties, that they'll spend all that money that they've had paying into a mortgage over the last few years that, you know, if you were able to and you were able to be sensible, you would put into a pension scheme as soon as you got that if you weren't going to be able to buy another property. So you were taken care of. But people have to try and balance out these facts. So that there is a lot of issues and strife on both elements that the Minister's proposing and Deputy Warr's is. So at this point, I can't support Deputy Warr's because I think that a £200,000 limit actually might create more problems for people later on. And I also think there is another group of people that might need help and assistance. And again, I mentioned care homes before. We don't have a huge demand for care homes. And if people are forced in just because they can't access a building with a lift, a lot of the social housing providers build blocks of flats with lifts. So actually accessing top floor flats is easier for people rather than having to find ground floor accommodation for people. So sir, I thank the Deputy for bringing this proposition. It has highlighted an issue that we need to consider when allowing people to access better designed property. Again, coming back to Deputy Curtis's question to the Minister for the Environment about the size of bathrooms. There's so many bathrooms that are built from many years ago which aren't wheelchair accessible. And again, we're talking about mobility, access for the disabled, people's lives change. So I think the scope, the intention of Deputy Warr's proposition is very, very good, but I think the scope is too small, and so that's why I can't support that at this stage. But I would encourage the Minister to bring his forward. Again, as Deputy Curtis says, let's bring it to scrutiny, let's have a look at it, and let's see what we can do with it from there. And I'll leave my comments there. So.
Very much. Deputy Andrews.
Thank you, sir. Deputy Warr contacted me probably about 6 weeks ago, and I was familiar with the case that he highlighted, and this is the reason why he brought forward this proposition. He wanted to find out what question I had asked regarding the old age state pension, and so I directed him to the relevant question on the States Assembly website. I just wanted to touch on one thing, sir, because I don't think it's been highlighted in the debate so far. Obviously, there has been a discrepancy that has been mentioned between the minimum wage and the old age state pension. And I understand why Deputy Warr has mentioned this. Often the case will be for those who are in receipt of an old age state pension, it will be the income support who are covering the rent, in addition to a transfer payment that the person will receive so they can actually live. Whereas if somebody is on a minimum wage, it is much dependable on how much the rent will be. Sometimes in cases it will be the government who are essentially covering the rent, and the person can then use their wage to live. In other circumstances, it might be the minimum wage is suffice for that person to cover their rent, but then they've only got a small amount to then live on. So it really is much dependent on the individual circumstance in that regard, which has been noted in the proposition. Another thing that I wanted to mention, sir, is in many cases, if you have somebody who is, say, 70 years of age, they own their own property, but they don't have much in savings. If they need to renovate the property, well, how can they do so? Because the income that they have is insufficient, so they cannot pay for contractors to come in and to do the work on their property. And so that makes it very difficult in those circumstances. And again, the person might be living in an accommodation that is very cold, and they don't have the finances to heat the property well enough to accommodate their needs. So I understand why Deputy Warr is trying to accommodate those individuals who are stuck, shall we say, in a very unfortunate position. Now, in quite a lot of the cases that we're probably looking at, we're looking at people who've actually got an implicit rent, so they don't have a mortgage that is still made payable, but there will be some pensioners who potentially do have a mortgage that is still made payable. Now, if they sell the property, they are then going to be in receipt of proceeds that are probably in excess of £200,000. And already what we do have in place is a criteria, so we will be looking at the person's history, their credit history, in terms of how much monies they have. And so often the case will be they will not be able to enter Andium homes because they have obviously been in a position where they will probably have to spend their money before they then fall below the threshold. And so that could be a potential issue in bringing forward this proposition. Work would have to be done to try and accommodate that area. But I do sympathise with the proposer, because I think there is also another group of people who are probably not touched upon during this debate, and that is the pensioners who live in private accommodation as well. They probably have insufficient savings. They might not be content in the unit of accommodation where they are living in, and so they want to maybe make the transition into Andium homes, but of course we've got a massive waiting list. And I think you have to be very careful when we're looking at the waiting list. What you don't want to do is you don't want to exacerbate the situation by opening up a whole different criteria, because what it will mean is that Andium homes and the Treasury will need to be discussing how will it be the case that we move forward, how do we build more homes, and what implications could there be for borrowing. Of course, we've got the credit facility, we've also got the bond, and we've also got the new £110 million that has recently been agreed, and that has to be serviced properly. And if you go reducing rents, for instance, then not enough income will be generated to service the debt, and that would probably then involve the Treasury having to cover the debt, because Andium cannot service the debt. So if there was any change to social policy, there could be massive implications in doing just that. There is also another thing that I just wanted to touch upon, sir, and that is more to do with pensioners, those who, for instance, have an implicit rent at this moment in time. If they are to make the transition into Andium homes, it will be the government who will be covering that rent, so income support will be expending more. And you just need to recognise that if that is going to be the case, if the criteria is going to change, how significant will the change be? How much more expenditure will be incurred? And what will happen to the longevity of income support in terms of the funds that are made available? Because I think that has to be something that is often realised, but obviously we don't really speak about it here in the Assembly unless there's a proposal that's being brought forward. So I do commend the Deputy for bringing forward this proposition, and quite clearly there is a need to support those who potentially own their own homes, or those who live in the private rental sector, to potentially see them make the transition into Andium homes. But of course, we do have to bear in mind that potentially there could be unintended consequences, and what those unintended consequences could bring about is significant change to the landscape of how the criteria is set out for tenants who are entering Andium homes as a social housing provider. So I think I've said all that I need to say, sir, and I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Whereabouts, Deputy Renouf?
Thank you, sir. I'm relieved from the speeches so far to see that I'm not the only member who's struggled to get my head around the issues in the proposition and the Minister's response. I feel a bit lost in a fog of war. So I've tried to go back to first principles to think about what problem we're trying to solve and what is the best way to solve it. As I understand it, Deputy Warr wants to try and help pensioners who are asset rich but cash poor to access social housing. This would give pensioners who are in the asset rich, cash poor category an opportunity to shed the burden of maintaining a large property and potentially free up large properties as pensioners moved into social housing. As I see it, the Minister seems to accept that this is a laudable aim, but thinks that the proposition doesn't help achieve the aim, and he has a better idea. So the question is, who is right? So the proposition deals only with pensioners. In fact, it is narrower than that. It would only affect pensioners with assets over 70,000 but under 200,000. Any pensioner with assets below 70,000 is already able to access the social housing gateway, and anyone with assets over 200,000 would still be excluded. And then, of course, there will only be a subset of this subset who are actually interested in accessing social housing at this stage of their lives. Therefore, my reading of this is that the proposition addresses a very small number of people. A consequence of this is that whilst there is clearly a strong desire expressed in some speeches to help those pensioners who find themselves asset rich and cash poor, the proposition is only relevant to a very small number of these people. The Minister's proposed solution takes a different tack. First, he recognises that there is a category of people who could be helped, but currently are not. But he has come up with a different solution that would allow anyone to access the housing gateway. But if their assets are over 80,000, then they will be put into band 3 and therefore lower down the scale of priority, unless their needs are judged to be great. I imagine he's thinking of a situation where they may have high outgoings to pay for medical needs, care needs, or something of that sort. Pressed to choose between the proposed solutions, I lean towards the Minister's, with the caveat that, as Deputy Alex Curtis said, that I would hope that that the Minister's proposals would be further developed in collaboration with members. It feels a bit rushed and panicky at the moment. But in principle, the Minister's solution is, I think, more elegant in that it is a more comprehensive solution. And I've actually don't fear the potential consequence of an increased demand for social housing in quite the way that Deputy Alex Curtis articulated. For me, the point is that the Minister's proposal has one critical difference over the proposition in that it allows real housing need to be considered in a more flexible way. The key difference is between the proposition and the Minister's proposal is where in the process the asset limit applies. In the proposition, it applies at the point of application to the gateway. If you are a pensioner with assets up to 200,000, you're in. You are then in exactly the same pool as people who have no assets, competing for the same limited supply of social housing. You join the queue. You might be ahead of someone else who applies after you, but who has no assets. Someone who is both cash poor and asset poor. However, if your assets are over 200,000, you're still entirely excluded from the system. And that, as I think other members have pointed out, seems to me to mean that the proposition does not address downsizing at all. Anyone who has a large house, which is by definition what we are talking about in downsizing, will, in 99% of cases, own an asset greater than £200,000. They will still not qualify for the housing gateway if this proposition is passed. They will therefore not be assisted to downsize. Downsizing is absolutely something that we need to tackle, but I don't think this is the solution to that problem. Under the Minister's proposal, assuming it's fleshed out a bit more and so on, the asset limit is irrelevant in terms of gaining access to the gateway. Anyone, not just pensioners, who wants to apply will gain access to the gateway. The asset limit only kicks in after you're in the system. At that point, if your assets are over 80,000, you move into band 3, a lower band than those with the highest need. However, because you are in the system, officers will be able to judge whether special circumstances mean that you should move into a higher band. For example, the medical need and so on that I referenced earlier. So given that we have to ration social housing, we have to ration social housing, and given that needs outstrip supply, but could we support the proposition on the grounds that it does no harm? Unfortunately, I don't think that is the case, because there is one problem with the proposition. It creates one single undifferentiated pool of applicants for social housing, which will be made up of anybody who has a housing need, including pensioners with assets up to £200,000. They will all move into the same, in other words, we will expand the numbers of people in that category of greatest need and include anybody with assets up to £200,000. These pensioners, asset rich and cash poor, yes, will be competing for social housing with those who, in objective terms, are in greater need. People who are not just cash poor, but asset poor as well. If the proposition passes, then anyone with up to £200,000 of assets will be in the same pool as someone with no assets. They will be in the queue on the first come, first served basis. And given that social housing does have to be rationed, it seems to me that the system should favour first those who are in the greatest need. This isn't to belittle the needs of pensioners who are asset rich and cash poor, but I think it is to see them in the context of the whole picture of housing need. So it seems to me that the proposer should take credit for recognising the issue and coming up with a solution. He has spurred the Minister into some creative thinking, and I hope that that goes further. But on the balance of what I have heard and what I understand of the issues, and I accept I may not have a complete understanding, I'm prepared to give the Minister the benefit of the doubt. We have to vote on the proposition, not the Minister's proposals, which of course still not fully public. But in the knowledge that there is a potential negative impact if the proposition is passed, and that in the knowledge that in general, I think the Minister's thinking is a positive response to the situation, I shall vote contra and see what the Minister comes up with. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Deputy. Deputy Councillor Curtis.
Thank you, sir. I don't believe I can support this proposition brought by Deputy Warr because I don't think it's valid. The proposition states, and I quote, "This proposition gives pensioners an option to sell off their home, pay off their mortgage, free up a home for the next generation, all while having the ability to secure tenure in social housing." But if pensioners were to follow this path, they could face a lot of unintended consequences, and I know we've heard some of these from previous speakers. Bearing in mind that the cheapest property sells for around £306,000 and the average three-bedroom house is £749,000, and that the majority of pensioners will either have no mortgage or a small mortgage, that means that selling their home would result in a much higher surplus than the asset limit suggested by Deputy Warr of £200,000. So assuming they want to move into social housing, they can't do so unless they spend or give away their surplus funds. So what do they do with the surplus funds above £200,000? I think most pensioners would choose to give that to their children. But if they do that, they will compromise any entitlement to LTC. Any money given away but to family will be included in assessment of long-term care needs funding, and they will no longer have the asset of their house to support their care needs, perhaps by renting it out. That would no longer be an option. So people would be left without straightforward access to the care they might need as they get older. Also, a pensioner with £200,000 in savings would have to pay rent on a social housing flat. Their rent payment would very likely be much more than anything they'd previously had to pay on any remaining mortgage. They wouldn't have their rent paid by income support. I asked Deputy Warr in his summing up speech to respond to the concerns I've raised over long-term care needs funding and income support. The Housing Minister has suggested a way forward which would allow people with assets to apply for social housing. Whichever way this is done, it will have to be a way that doesn't create unintended consequences.
Very much, Deputy Dublet.
Thank you, sir. I started this debate not really knowing which way I was going to go, and I think I have decided that it's not something I can support today, but I wanted to thank Deputy Warr for bringing it, because I think it's one of those debates where maybe it won't be supported by the Assembly, but I think that the issues that Deputy Warr has brought today are really, really important. Sorry, sir, I can hear some other speech. I don't know if that's coming from the chamber.
No, there's total silence within the chamber, Deputy. So.
Okay. Apologies. Deputy Tadia's speech I found interesting because he raised the point that actually this isn't about housing, it's about income, and I thought that was a really pertinent point. But of course, in Jersey, they're inextricably linked because most people's income is going on their housing. And I know that there's a measure of relative low income, which is linked to the amount of the proportion of a person's or household income which is spent on housing. And I tried to look up the data on this. I don't think the data on that has been collected or published since 21-22. So first of all, I think we need more data to understand these issues. I think Deputy Reniff tried to pin down some of the numbers behind it and actually what the implications are. But I don't think we actually, and I think he did a good job of that, but I don't think we have all of the data that we need to have a really informed conversation about what sectors of our society whose needs aren't being met and how we can change that. And I was looking up at some UK data on this, and I think it's the Joseph Rowntree Foundation published information on minimum income standards, and they describe that minimum income standard as people having what they need in order to have the opportunities and choices necessary to participate in society. And I think that's where our conversation and our policy making and legislation needs to focus and needs to start on. I don't think that necessarily just focusing on a small area and trying to have a kind of piecemeal approach to it, I'm not sure that's entirely the right way to go about it. Because there are some groups, I think it was Deputy Reniff pointed out, there may be some groups that have higher need. Pensioners in our society are at greater risk of living in relative poverty than pensioners in the UK. So they are indeed, they do have needs, and that's something that I would like to see ministers addressing. But when we look at data such as, I think it was from the Jersey Opinions and Lifestyle Survey, the most recent survey, it pointed out that yes, 24% of pensioners found it difficult to cope financially. But there are other situations that people can be in. People living alone, 36% of working age people living alone found it difficult to cope financially. And I'm not sure where eligibility for the housing gateway stands with people who are single people. Couples with children, 47% of them found it difficult to cope financially. And right at the top of the scale there, 82% of single parents found it difficult to cope financially. So there are different groups of people on our island who have different characteristics and are finding it really difficult to cope, and housing is a massive factor in that. What I would like to see is the work on the minimum income standard, which I believe is being worked on by the cost of living group. If there are any ministers that could comment on that and confirm that that work is still underway and the date by which that would be completed, that would be helpful, because I think we need that to inform our policy making in this area of housing and income. I think so. Deputy Curtis mentioned access to long-term care, and she made some interesting points, and I'm not exactly sure what the solution is to this, but I think sometimes we have situations whereby you have a couple or an individual who is elderly and is starting to need care and owns a property, and they may have children who may be on income support and being funded in that way. And it may actually be better for the taxpayer for that elderly couple or elderly person to be able to gift some money for the purpose of their children purchasing housing, and then the income support not being needed, but the long-term care being needed. And I think the nuances in that situation, I think there should be a way for us to be able to weigh that up and see actually what would be the most reasonable option. So in summary, I think really important issues that have been raised today, but I think the views expressed, I would like to see them taken into account when ministers are working on the minimum income standard. If there are any ministers that could update, I'm not sure if the Chief Minister has spoken yet in this debate, if we could get an update on that work, because I think it does relate to the subject that we've discussed today in terms of affordability of housing and affordability of living generally in Jersey.
Thank you very much. Deputy Fellow.
Thank you, sir. I'm pleased to follow the previous speakers, in particular Deputy Reniff, who I think articulated the issues at hand today very well. But I do want to make a few points and address a few of the items that previous speakers have raised. But firstly, I do want to put it on record that pensioner poverty is not tolerated. Income support is available to pensioners who are on low incomes and would be available to some of those pensioners who do own their own homes as well. So I would encourage any pensioner that is struggling financially to contact my department to ensure that they are receiving their full entitlements. I think that's incredibly important, and I have asked my department to do more communication to ensure that people are more aware about the types of support that is available to them at different stages of life. I do want to address, and I think Deputy Reniff actually articulated this very well around, and Deputy Curtis as well, around who this proposition is actually trying to help. And I want to address something that Deputy Ozef said yesterday, because he used an example of a pensioner couple living in his constituency with a 3-bedroom home, and said that this would be the type of person that this proposition would help. I don't believe that that is so, because the average cost, and I think Deputy Catherine Curtis articulated this very well, of that type of home would indeed be above this £200,000 limit. So I think in that sense, the limit that is suggested in this proposition hasn't been well thought through. And also, as Deputy Catherine Curtis was entirely right, hasn't been thought through in terms of the other unintended consequences and knock-on effects of what may happen in terms of other benefits such as long-term care as well. Deputy Andrews mentioned the effect on income support. I did want to correct that, because Deputy Andrews did seem to have an assumption that everybody that lives in social housing is in receipt of income support. That is not correct. People can continue to live in social housing, and that is the point of social housing. It's a home for life. As well. So very often people may enter social housing, be on income support, and then come out of that. But the connection, there isn't a direct connection between eligibility for social housing and eligibility for income support. This proposition wouldn't change that. The proposer in his opening speech talked a lot about data and the need for the collation of data. And this is where, and I speak to the Minister for Housing on a regular basis, and talking to him about his plans, which unfortunately the proposer of this proposition didn't do ahead of lodging this proposition, and perhaps if that had been the case, the proposition may have been better put together, is that actually I know that the Minister wants to collect data, and one of the thoughts behind one of the process that he wants to follow is that opening up access to the housing gateway in that broadest sense actually enables us to encourage people to engage directly with the Housing Advice Service, which is in the department that is shared by myself and the Housing Minister. And that housing advice service will be able to then collect data about the circumstances that are leading people to make that decision to say, yes, I want to apply for social housing. So that might well give us both it would give us information about the reasons that people may or may not wish to downsize, whether they wish to go into an Andium home or a housing trust home, for example, whether they wish to engage with their parishes, because of course I know that our constables do a lot of work in providing and trying to provide secure accommodation for the pensioners in their parish as well. So I do think that the Minister is doing some good work, had some good plans in place, has had to react to a certain extent to this proposition. But again, I will reiterate it is a shame that the proposer didn't speak with the Minister, because instead of then causing that reactive response, he may well have decided not to lodge this proposition due to the work that is already in hand. Deputy Dublé mentioned the minimum income standard piece of work. I was very pleased to enable a budget which is now under the Minister for Sustainable Economic Development, as he chairs the Cost of Living Ministerial Group, which I sit on. Deputy Dublé, I can assure her that myself and the Minister for Sustainable Economic Development are meeting to discuss that piece of work next week. So I will, of course, update Deputy Dublé, but I do share her interest in understanding the cost of living pressures on all demographic groups in our society, so that we can look at the very best solutions possible. So I encourage people not to support this proposition. I don't think it's been very well thought through. I don't think it's going to achieve the stated aim of reducing pensioner poverty. And I encourage the Assembly to put its trust in our Housing Minister, who I know is taking these issues very, very seriously. And I will continue to work with him to address them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy. Does any other member wish to speak on this proposition?
So may I make a point of clarification on my own speech? It's not a replication, it is a clarification.
In other words, you said something that you think was unclear.
Yes.
Yes, I think that's reasonable in the circumstances.
Thank you, sir, and I don't like to do this. In my speech, I mentioned the power of... it isn't a second speech to the Deputy. I mentioned subordinate legislation. I did so on the fact that the Minister used the phrase ministerial order in his speech yesterday, which I've checked the transcript on the YouTube. In checking, I do not believe that there is a power under subordinate legislation. I don't believe subordinate legislation changes the affordable housing gateway criteria, and therefore I think I spoke erroneously in saying a member could annul such decision. Because I believe the Minister misspoke in saying it was a ministerial order. I believe he signed a ministerial decision. And so I believe, to clarify what I said, there is no power under states legislation for a member to use the legislation 2021 law to do so. And I feel I misspoke on that, sir, because I was taking the leave of the use of the word ministerial order in the speech yesterday.
Thank you very much. Sorry, does any other member wish to speak? Deputy Gardner.
Thank you, sir. I do, as many people here, struggle with this proposition. But what is really taking me back, that I understand and I know that we need to look on whole population, but we also know that we are always looking at the family separate, at the children separate, we do children right assessment separate. And I do believe there is a place to have a debate about pensioners and elderly population, and not to try to say we will do for everyone, not just for them. Sometimes we do, I said actually we do need to do for them as well. And this is where I decided to stand up and speak. When this proposition was launched, I had the current parishioner case that the parishioner was on gateway from September 21. parishioner has very, very complex health needs that she will not able to address these health needs on open private market. In 2021, parishioner submitted all documents, including her savings, and was accepted. In February this year, parishioner got a telephone call from Andum saying that she passed her mid-year review. We're talking about September 21, February 25, that she passed her mid-year review, and the housing coming on the market sometime during the summer, and finally she probably will be able to move. But in March 2025, after audit, she received the confirmation that her application is cancelled because she is above 70,000. So audit has been done only in March this year. I know there is an option of the appeal, and the appeal will go forward. But somebody who needed this support, not actually financial support, but her saving will not help person to get on the housing getaway. It was waiting for the housing getaway, and it has been cancelled because past the threshold. This is where it's taking me back. Now, I tried for the last two sittings to get from the Minister for Housing, actually it was also the question for the Chief Minister, but it was redirected to the Minister of Housing, what the Minister of Housing done to, what projects were initiated during the last year and a half to allow independent living for elderly population as it was adopted in the Common Strategic Policy. I know there are not perfect solutions. I think there is something else that I strongly feel. The message that we are trying to say, that if the pensioner was being prudent and saving for old age, which is something that we should encourage, that actually if you go on holiday, spend and get rid of your cash because you might be penalized for the saving, you can get on the housing getaway. Sometimes it's just extra 20,000, go on the world cruise for a year. And you'll not have savings and you'll get on the getaway. Where I'm finding myself, I listened to Deputy Renouf, I also listened back on recording to a minister's speech. I understand this proposition is not perfect. It is not perfect. Now, as Deputy Feltham said that it hasn't been thought through, maybe probably there are gaps. But the question, was any engagement since the proposition was lodged from the minister with Deputy Warr to trying to actually talk it through? I don't know, I can see so now two heads waving and I'm not sure what to make up, was engagement, wasn't engagement. But I think the point, as most of the members said, the Deputy Warr raised, is a valid point. We need to support these people. And I would expect that this proposition could be delayed for 2, 3, 4 months, that the Deputy and the Minister could work out the solution, but I don't think it's happened. So was it, if the unintended consequences will be damaging? Not sure. It might be small scope to progress, but that is clear for me. It's about time that we need to speak in this assembly, focusing on elderly population and pensioners. I will listen to the closing speech and make my mind then.
David Wilson.
Thank you, sir. I just wanted to respond to some of the arguments that were raised by Deputy Mezek in opposition to this proposition. I mean, it's really clear that Deputy Mezek is committed to broadening access and has over time demonstrated a long-standing advocacy for housing justice. And however, I just feel that his position on this proposition is not only unrealistic, but I also think it's counterproductive, and I will explain why. I also feel that, particularly for the very people he seeks to protect, it's a bit of a reaction to I think, what a proposition that's quite innovative and has stimulated a debate in the Assembly, and would have, I think, had we heard from the Minister, would have, first on this, perhaps might have got quite a lot of support for him in moving this matter forward. I'd like to think that the Minister would welcome ideas from backbenchers, and if he is actually genuinely interested, to build on them. And will he commit to working with Deputy Warr to progress the plans going forward? I mean, you know, we've got two really interesting perspectives bringing to bear here, and I think working together on this, I think, would yield a better outcome. But the idea, I think, of opening the gateway to everyone that Deputy Mezek is proposing, without any financial thresholds or limits or things like that, sounds progressive in theory. But in practice, at this moment in time, I think it risks collapsing the system under its own weight. The gateway is not just a waiting list, it's how we prioritise access. And if we do remove eligibility, we turn it into a first come, first serve queue. And the reality is that somebody who is actually experiencing poverty could be left waiting behind someone who's simply dissatisfied with their current rent, and that's what we want to avoid. Deputy Warr's proposition, by contrast, does not throw open the doors indiscriminately. It does update income thresholds to reflect the real cost of living, so that people who are struggling to keep up are no longer locked out of the social housing gateway. And crucially, his proposition directly addresses the forgotten poor islanders, mainly, many of whom are elderly, who have assets but no income. And they are the ones that we don't hear about. They are the ones that we know that there is evidence, which we're not gathering, who are living difficult lives. They're facing hardship, but they're excluded by the criteria that we've set out, which is now, quite frankly, decades out of date. So what I would like to say is that this proposition, for me, is a balance of compassion and control. It's about accessibility and it's about accountability. And to reject this in favour of a no-threshold approach really is to substitute the principle of practicality. We all agree housing is a right, but that right must be managed within the bounds of availability, fairness and responsible governance. And unfortunately, I think Deputy Mezek's counter-argument is one that assumes infinite supply, but we don't live in that world. We live in a world where people are already waiting too long for affordable housing. And I accept that his policy direction is to try and expand that as much as we can. But budgets are tight, and we've actually got to take account of what we can deliver now. He also speaks of inclusion. And rightly so, but inclusion without prioritising what we need to do is actually exclusion by another name. So if we do widen access so far that the system cannot function, we actually end up failing the people who need it most. The other thing I'd like to comment about is the fact that I didn't really hear any evidence or information from the Housing Minister that had any basis in fact. He admits himself it's impossible to estimate how many will enter the housing gateway if Deputy Warr's proposition is adopted. But, you know, he could have undertaken some activity when he saw this proposition coming forward. He could have done some financial modelling himself. He could have actually put some assumptions to us and calculated the cost. Just like Deputy Warr has done, actually, which very clearly outlines the benefits of introducing the proposition and the data on how many households this is likely to affect. So, in conclusion, I am of the view that Deputy Warr's proposition doesn't weaken the gateway. In actual fact, it strengthens it for those who are struggling. It makes it more reflective of the lives islanders are actually living in 2025, not the lives we imagined in 2005. So this proposition is a reminder to the Assembly that we have to apply practical compassion, and the proposition does exactly that. So I think that's all I want to say about it. I think if we do open and remove all of the barriers, I just find that this would be simply irresponsible, and I do believe it's a knee-jerk reaction to what is a reasonable, proportionate, well-through proposition, and I will be supporting it.
Very much. Deputy Kovac.
Thank you, sir. I understand why Deputy Warr brought this proposition, and I sympathize with the intention. The concerns about older islanders and their housing security are real, and I share the desire to support them and everyone in need for that matter, hence my proposition for next sitting to make social rents truly affordable. However, I believe this proposition, while well-meant, does not offer the best solution. It risks being unfair to those most in need. Yes, some pensioners do face challenges, but many have savings, own their homes, or receive private pensions. These islanders may want the comfort of social housing, but they are not always in urgent need. Deputy Warr's proposal would lift the savings limit to 200,000 just for pensioners. That means someone with 200,000 in the bank, as the proposition mentions savings too, not just assets, would be treated the same as someone with almost nothing, and how is that fair? Linking on the personal example by Deputy Coles, I'm on the same age, but I don't own a home, and I've never had 200,000 in my bank account. People with real financial need, older or younger, should come first. Should someone with substantial savings jump the queue ahead of someone who is homeless, on a very low income, or in medical crisis? That's why I support the alternative proposal from Minister Mezek. It's fair, it's flexible, and it shouldn't be restricted to Deputy Warr's proposition. Minister's proposal removes the savings cap completely, so everyone can apply. But it also sets a sensible rule. If you have more than 80,000 in savings, you start in a lower priority band, unless there's a medical or social need. In those cases, the gateway can adjust your banding. This approach helps us support people with genuine need, while still making space for those who want to right-size or live with peace of mind. It's a balanced way forward. On that ground, I ask members to reject the proposition, not because we don't care, but because we do. Let's support a fairer system that helps everyone based on their needs, not just on their age or savings. Thank you.
Very much. Deputy Scott.
Thank you, sir. Sir, the bringer of this proposition is not alone in having identified that some of his elderly constituents are worrying about losing financial independence and about their savings running out. This debate has been useful in highlighting why there has been a trend in modern policy making to move away from what can be seen to be random thresholds. Where is the fairness in them? 1 penny below, you are in. 1 penny over, you are out. I accept that Deputy Ward's proposition is well-intentioned, but thresholds create inequity. Not everyone with 200k of the savings needs social housing. And I spoke with the Housing Minister in depth regarding his solution that he's been working on last evening, as might any states member have done to seek more clarity. The solution isn't complex, and in terms of the positive intent of this proposition, I believe it is a fair compromise. Yes, it maintains the current savings threshold, uplifting it by £10,000. People, however, who have more savings than 80,000, nevertheless would be permitted to apply to join the gateway, whatever the level of their savings. However, people with savings of more than £80,000 would not automatically be given the same priority as those with lesser savings, and individual needs will be considered, because one size does not fit all. Some concerns have been raised regarding the sustainability of the social housing model, also the lack of data. It is something to be mindful of as policy evolves. It does not justify an inequitable model. I support the Minister's solution for its simplicity and for seeking to be equitable. I do not support the current proposition for not being equitable, and I encourage colleagues, therefore, to reject the current proposition.
Does any other member wish to speak on this proposition? Deputy Balash.
So I view the proposition of Deputy Warr as bringing about a tweak in the processes. Deputy Renouf may be right. It may affect only a small number of people, but that's not, in my view, a reason for not supporting it. It opens the possibility for some extra people to enter the gateway if they feel the need to do so. I'm not sure that I understand the Minister's solution, but his aim is not one with which I can sympathise. His opening sentence in the comments states, "It is my aim to encourage more islanders to access social housing." My own view is that social housing is a safety net for the vulnerable in our society. It should not become a larger and larger proportion of our housing stock. Indeed, people whose circumstances change and who no longer need the safety net should be encouraged, in my view, to leave social housing and not rely upon a subsidy from the state. It's a different philosophical approach, and I will support Deputy Warr.
Does any other member wish to speak on the proposition? If no other member wishes to speak, I close the debate and call upon Deputy Warr to respond.
Thank you, sir, and I thank all members who've spoken today, because I think it has highlighted, and I thank Deputy Gardner for making that point, that we have an older generation who are struggling, and we to have a security of tenure, who are living in impoverished positions, and there are all sorts of safety nets, but we cannot get away from the fact that some number of individuals who spent their life in our society, in Jersey, have contributed to society and now turn to government to try and be looked after and have a better quality of life. I think that's a good aspiration. I thank you, Deputy Gardner, for making that point. The line which has struck me overnight was made by Deputy Joseph, and I say this is a bridge to dignity. And Deputy Wilson spoke about the forgotten poor, and I think absolutely nailed it. The facts are that there are 5,200 pensioners in relative low income after housing costs. Deputy Joseph helpfully pointed out that the UK figures are 18%, whereas in Jersey that number is 28%. So we really do have a problem. I agree with Deputy Taddia. We do need some blue sky thinking. We do need fresh thinking in this area. And to Deputy Scott's point, thresholds aren't a great measure, but they are the system we have in place at the moment, and I can't change that system right now. But maybe it is a point is, what do we define as thresholds? How do we create a new concept of thresholds? To Deputy Alex Curtis's point, he talks about, yes, the build programme does show that we can accommodate an adjustment to the gateway to get more people into social housing, give them more greater security of tenure. That's why I brought it along. Otherwise, what's the point? What's the point of opening up the gateway fully, knowing that people can't get access to a housing? And this is what concerns me about the Minister's commentary, is this kind of carte blanche approach. And again, I go back to Deputy Feltham's comment saying he's had to react to my proposition. He's had plenty of time to look at my proposition and come back to me. We've had one engagement which basically has told me, I'm not going to support your proposition. I don't know how you want to proceed. I mean, that's not engagement. That's just basically telling me his stance on the situation. So we could have been a lot more constructive and maybe not needed to have this debate. But I think it's really important that we have had this debate today, because I hope it starts a journey. And that is the point about this proposition, whether it succeeds or fails today. This is about a journey. This is a start to recognize our older cohort of people. I mean, I spoke earlier in my speech about our rejection of the tax, the petition which was brought to the Assembly with 5,000 signatories to exempt Social Security, old age pension income from tax. We argued about that in this Assembly, but we really hacked off a huge number of people out there who want us to do real things for them. You know, we've had a senatorial debate and all the rest of it. People want real stuff done by us in this Assembly. This is about doing real stuff and being real. So, as I say, my approach to this has been one of, the data's limited, I don't know all the data, the minister knows the data's limited, he doesn't have the data either, but instead of that, he's just kind of whacked this sort of taken a nuclear approach to it and said, no, we're just going to stick a band 3 in and we're just going to whack everybody onto a band without thinking it through, without any data, without actual evidence, and that's the bit that really grates with me in all of this. So as I say, what I would like to do, and I want to say this in a constructive way, as a member of the EHI panel, it would be really helpful if the minister went away, thought through his proposals about opening this up and looking at this, and he brings that to the scrutiny panel, where we can have a look at it and develop that policy further. I think we just need careful development through. We can't just, as I say, I don't want to reference my Michael Caine moment, but we don't want to blow up the van. We just want to take the doors off. So that is the point of this, and as I say, I really appreciate the debate, and I'm sure we will have debates in the future along this subject. But this is about action now. So my proposition here is about opening up that gateway just a little bit, just opening the door a tiny amount, 200,000, which is tiny as per my figures, to give a cohort of people a better quality, an opportunity for a better quality of life and a bit more security in their home. That is simply all as I'm doing. I'm not trying to do magical things. This is simply a one step forward. Action today with a policy intent which the minister can carry on and develop going forward. And that's what I want to do. Action today. And for that, I call the appel. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Deputy. The appel is called for. I invite members to return to their seats. And the vote is on P.26. And I ask the greffier to open the voting and members to vote. If members have had the opportunity of casting their vote, then I ask the greffier to close the voting. The proposition has been defeated. 7 votes pour, 30 votes contre, 6 abstentions.
Could we have the...
Those members voting pour, Deputies Gardner, Osoph, Balash, Warr, Miles, Barbara Ward and Wilson. Those members voting contre, the Connétable, St Helier, St Bellard, Trinity, St John, Grouville, St Juan, St Mary and St Saviour, and Deputies Southern, Tadia, Luce, Lehigra, Ayer, Farnham, Mezek, Coles, Porray, Scott, Renouf, Catherine Curtis, Feltham, Miller, Ferry, Kovac, Alex Curtis, Andrews, Alves, Stevenson, Doublé, and the Connétable of St Clement. And those members abstaining, the Connétable St Martin, and Deputies Labby, Rose Binet, Jearn, Howe, and Tom Binet.
Very well. That concludes the public business, and I call upon the Chair of PPC to propose the business for future meetings.
Thank you, sir. At the moment, 7 items are currently listed for debate on May the 13th, and I expect that we'll be sitting for 2 days. I would like to take this opportunity to remind members that our next sitting is a special Liberation 80 sitting on Friday the 9th of May. This special sitting of the States will take place in Liberation Square at 11 a.m. Please arrive by 10:30 a.m. and I believe that an email with timings will be sent to all members from the bailiff's chambers. Sir, I propose the arrangement of business.
Members agree the arrangements for future business?
May I kindly give notice that following my withdrawal of the proposition, my indication to the States, I'll be lodging a standalone proposition in relation to the fuel farm, subject to discussions with ministers, and be requesting, if necessary, because of the timescales. But I hope that's not going to be necessary, but it may help ministers.
Deputy Haggerty, did you wish to?
Yes, sir. It was just really to advise members that on the 13th of May, the Tuesday, that I will be in London in relation to the British Irish Mediterranean region half-yearly meeting, so I won't be here, but obviously any oral questions can be answered by my Assistant Minister. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Deputy. Very well. I think members approve the arrangement for future business. Accordingly, that concludes matters before the Assembly today, and we stand adjourned until the special sitting for Liberation Day on the 9th of May.